Straight Up Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Straight Up Podcast, a show about international affairs with a focus on East Asia and, of course, Taiwan. I'm your host, Chris Gorin, coming to you from Taipei, Taiwan. Before I introduce my guest today, I have an important update about this show that I'd like to share with you. Some of you may already know about this, but after more than a year here at Radio Taiwan International, I will be moving on to work on a new endeavor. I've really enjoyed my time working here at RTI, especially working alongside such talented coworkers who have become good friends of mine. Furthermore, being able to engage with our listeners through my other show, Status Update, has also been really gratifying. But the time has come for me to move on, and while I'm a little sad to leave, the good news is that I will be continuing this show, the Straight Up Podcast, producing it independently on a new podcast feed. So if you're interested in following me beyond this episode, I'll be providing all the relevant website, podcast feed, and contact information for myself at the end of this episode, so please refer to that if you'd like to continue listening. I've already got a couple episodes I'm working on with some really interesting guests, so if you want to hear more, please stick around at the end of this episode. But I don't want to waste any more time before getting to today's guest, because I'm very excited to have him on. It is indeed an honor to have as my final guest before this podcast moves to a new home, Mike Chinoy. Mike was the first head of CNN's Beijing bureau, which opened in 1987, and his time there included covering historic events such as the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989. He is now a non-resident senior fellow at the University of Southern California's U.S.-China Institute. Mike is also the author of the recent book, Assignment China, An Oral History of American Journalists in the People's Republic. The book offers first-hand accounts from American journalists of what it was like to report from inside China over the decades, from the post-World War II period through to today. Mike also produced a multi-part documentary series of the same name, which includes footage and interviews with these journalists. In this interview, we cover a number of topics and historical events described in the book, including reporting on the Cultural Revolution, President Richard Nixon's visit to China, the Tiananmen Square crackdown, and the outbreak of COVID-19, along with many other topics. So now I bring you Mike Chinoy. I am here with Mike Chinoy, who is, I guess, best known for being the first Beijing bureau chief at CNN, has now moved on to USC. But I'd like to give my guests a little of an opportunity to describe how they view their own career and what they're doing these days. So, tell us a little bit about your career, or however you describe yourself, and what you're doing now.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I was a foreign correspondent for more than 30 years, the bulk of that time, 24 years as a foreign correspondent for CNN. I started my journalistic career as a China watcher in Hong Kong in the mid-1970s, and then I became CNN's first Beijing bureau chief when the network opened a bureau in China in 1987. It was 8 years in Beijing, then spent several years in Hong Kong before leaving CNN. I'm now a non-resident senior fellow at the University of Southern California's U.S.-China Institute, where I continue to look at issues in China and Northeast Asia and devote the bulk of my time to writing books.
All right. Yeah, and the non-resident part there is key, I suppose, because you live here in Taiwan. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
Yes.
That's correct.
So lucky for us.
And before that, I was non-resident in Hong Kong for several years.
Nice. And you have this great new book that has just come out, Assignment China, An Oral History of American Journalists in the People's Republic, which is kind of a companion piece to a series of documentaries that you guys also did, which is available on YouTube. I will have a link to that in the show notes for those who are interested. And I didn't have a chance to watch all of that because it's quite a lot of content, but I did watch a little bit, and it's really interesting. So I recommend everyone go check it out. I did want to ask you, though, when did that series, the documentary series, finish? Because it seemed like it was from like almost 10 years ago was the last one that came out.
The documentary series, we began work on it in 2008, and the last episode, I guess, finished in 2015. But the idea of the series, and it's also the idea of the book, Assignment China, the premise underpinning it is that most people know what they know about China from what they read in the newspapers or watch on TV or listen to on the radio. But most consumers of news don't have the slightest idea how the news that they're reading or watching actually got there. And given the importance of the China story and given the clout and importance of the American media, of American news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the wire services, in shaping the narrative about China. My colleagues and I thought it would be really interesting to try, in effect, to tell the story of the people who've told the China story over multiple decades. Who were these people? How did they end up in China? What did they do? I mean, what did you do if you were the Life magazine correspondent in Shanghai in 1949 with the Red Army knocking at the gates? What was it like to be a China watcher in Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s, trying to make sense of phenomenon like the upheavals of the Chairman Mao's great proletarian cultural revolution, when you couldn't go into China to see for yourself? What was it like traveling on Nixon's press plane when he opened the door to U.S.-China relations in 1972, or to be the first New York Times correspondent when a bureau was finally opened after the normalization of U.S.-China relations, or to cover Tiananmen Square or the rise of China, or to expose human rights abuses in Xinjiang, or cover the COVID outbreak. Because the experience that experience is something that shapes very much what the coverage is. And the decisions that people make on a daily basis, where to go, who to talk to, what information they get, how to weigh that up, their interactions with their editors, their interactions with the Chinese authorities, the limitations of technology, how do you file your story, where do you get a phone line or a satellite link, how do you deal with situations like martial law in Beijing after Tiananmen Square. All of this is like a huge melting pot, and all of that goes into what you, the news consumer, see on your TV or listen to on the radio or read. And most people don't have a clue. So to give that background and context, I think will help readers, enjoy an amazing story, because journalists are the people who witness the first, they're at you have a front row seat to history, and also to make people more sophisticated consumers of news, so they can weigh up in a more intelligent way what it is they're seeing and watching and reading, and figure out what they think about it.
Yeah, and the scope of the book is actually quite large. I was really surprised just to see. I mean, it's a reasonably long book. Yeah, it covers everything from the end of the Civil War all the way up to the present day, and there's a lot of really interesting stories, and I think it's easy for a general audience to read it, because it's just straight from the mouth of all these interviews that had been conducted with all these journalists over the years. So it's it doesn't really have a direct narrative, but you get all of these little vignettes of what it was like to be a reporter in China across all these different periods.
It's a little bit like what I tried to capture was, at the end, I was foreign correspondent for many, many years. And at the end of the day, you're on an assignment, you file your story, you go to the hotel bar, you order a stiff drink because it's been a rough day, and you sit down and you talk shop with your colleagues. How did you get that story? What happened? What was your fight with your boss about what was the lead going to be? Or you wanted to make it 5 minutes and they only wanted 1 minute and 30 seconds, or you wanted to be on page 1, but they put you on page 15. All of these kind of behind the scenes dynamics. And what tried to capture both in the documentary series and in the book Assignment China is a little bit of that sense of the experience of it. Because people, when they absorb the news, it seems like it's this all-knowing, omniscient, authoritative, this is what happened. And in fact, I first started as a journalist working for CBS News in the days of Walter Cronkite, the great CBS anchorman, who ended his show every night by saying, "And that's the way it is, Monday, September 10th." But the reality is it's an extraordinarily complicated and messy process trying to figure out what the way it is, and so to convey a little bit of that sense of the complexity of the human frailties, of the accidents of chance, so many factors go into it, and it's a very human process, even though the final thing comes off in such a kind of authoritative and polished way.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I had like two sort of feelings as I was reading the book. One is Yeah, because you do kind of get the sense of, or at least for me, I don't know, maybe people have a different image, but that reporters are, like you said, this sort of like omniscient thing where but when you read the book, you realize that they are just people like going to work every day. This is a job, and it humanizes them in a really important way. But I think it also really shows the level of professionalism and the dedication that a lot of these journalists have, and especially going to a place that is like fairly risky for journalists. And I think that that's something that like is really important right now, because I think that journalism has gotten kind of a bad name in the last few years. And so it's really refreshing to just have this account of not just what is being reported, and you're not questioning like, was this a legitimate report or not, but just to show the tenacity of these people actually doing the work on the ground.
Journalism, in my view, is a craft that has certain kind of values that underpin it. The importance of asking questions, of not taking anything at face value, of doing your level best to make sure you got the facts right, that there are multiple views or perspectives on an event, to at least try and get a sense of what they are and reflect that in your reporting. And for me, as somebody who did this kind of work for so many years, one of the great joys of this project was to go and talk to people, many of whom I knew, but others whom I only knew of by name or reputation, who were really towering figures in our profession. Some of whom, because of the passage of time, are not known at all today, but who did really important work. And I think there is a sense of integrity, of a commitment to try and get it right, of a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, not take no for an answer, keep digging and pushing. And part of what I think comes across is a sense of a kind of street smarts, and a sort of just crude cunning, and the things you have to do to get around the rules. And they're wonderful stories. For example, Morley Safer, who was a great CBS News correspondent, most well known in his later years as one of the hosts of the CBS News magazine program 60 Minutes, was a correspondent in the 1960s, was a Canadian, and at the height of the Cultural Revolution, he was able to get into mainland China by pretending he was an art historian, something like that, with a cameraman who pretended he was a travel agent, and they got tourist visas. And they rigged up a little camera a professional camera that made it look like a camera that a tourist would carry. And they went to China for a month, and they produced the only serious documentary report on the Cultural Revolution that aired on American television. And they did it by beating the Chinese system and getting in despite the fact that the Chinese weren't welcoming journalists. And it provided a remarkable window, and included such astonishing episodes as Safer being put on trial by angry Red Guards who overheard him making a disparaging comment about a tractor. And that gives you a tremendous insight into the mentality at the sort of most extreme moments of the Cultural Revolution. But it takes a certain kind of, nerve and cunning to keep your wits about you and do that. And you see that over and over in the story of the photographer who took the famous photo of the man in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square in 1989, or some of the reporters who went to Xinjiang in more recent years, defying the authorities and collecting information which documented the mass repression of the Uyghur Muslims. So it takes kind of guts and willingness to do what is necessary without losing sight of the integrity of the journalistic process. And I think most of the reporters who feature in Assignment China, they didn't always get everything right, because it's not impossible in the moment to get everything right. But they made a good faith effort to do so, and by and large, I think, did so without imposing a political agenda. And unfortunately, today, so much of the quote-unquote media has become very politicized, and media organizations are associated with a position on the right or the center or the left of the spectrum. And I think by and large, the reporters who covered China over the decades tried to avoid that, or even in an environment where it existed, tried not to let it dominate what they covered or how they covered it.
Yeah, reading about it, one thing that kind of really struck me is just, before smartphones and everything, how easy it was to kind of keep things in the dark. I remember there's a segment in talking about the reporters during the Cultural Revolution, talking about how they knew that there was something really crazy happening in China, but they didn't really know what it was. I think someone describes it as there was a struggle of sea monsters going on deep in the water, but all they would see is the bubbles rising to the surface. So yeah, tell us a little bit what it was like for those reporters during the Cultural Revolution, when...
Well, that's one of my favorite quotes. It's from Theodore White, who was a famous correspondent for Time magazine in China during World War II, and then later became a very distinguished journalist in the States. And he did a program in 1967 on the Cultural Revolution. Well, one of the challenges of China watching is that when you're not in the country and you can't see it for yourself, you just have to look for clues. And so people during the Cultural Revolution were sitting in Hong Kong. They were perusing the Chinese media and looking for clues in the kind of language that was used. They were interviewing refugees. They were looking for whatever signs they could. And you knew something was going on, but it was very hard to tell what it was. And so you had to figure out, for example, the leadership lineup at an Albanian National Day reception might be different now than the leadership lineup at a Yugoslavian National Day reception 3 months earlier. That tells you that this person is up or this person is down. Or one of the reporters talked about various kind of Chinese artistic pieces were suddenly were ending up in Hong Kong for sale. And this was partly because Mao had put out an order to destroy with the so-called four olds, old habits, culture, and so on. And so Red Guards were ransacking these priceless cultural artifacts, and some of them were kind of getting them out to Hong Kong to sell them and make money. So you piece these clues together. And that when I started as a journalist in Hong Kong, it was 1975, and it was right before Mao's death. And so my first 18 months as a foreign correspondent was very much doing the same thing, because particularly American journalists weren't allowed into China. My first full year as a journalist started with the death of Premier Zhou Enlai in January of 76. Then there was the first Tiananmen Square riot in April of that year, in which Deng Xiaoping, who later emerged as China's paramount leader and the architect of the reform program, was purged for the second time by the ultra-left radicals. Then there was the Tangshan earthquake, which killed 250,000 people, which the Chinese did not let anybody go to witness. Then there was Mao's death. And then there was the purging of Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, and her radical followers known as the Gang of Four. And all of this happened across the border in China, and I didn't see any of it myself. So I was sitting there, plowing through the Chinese press, looking for clues, interviewing the odd foreign traveler. We would monitor the news every night at 7 o'clock on Canton television, Guangdong television, to see what photos there were. And that's how we put the pieces together. And the irony is that China then opened up, and there was this period which is documented in the book, As I'm in China, and in the series, of more and more access, more and more journalists going in, getting closer to Chinese reality. But in the last few years, it's kind of come back full circle. China shut itself off to the world because of COVID. The Chinese government expelled large numbers of American journalists and have denied visas to American and many others. So that today, while there's still a small number of reporters resident in China, places like Taipei have become kind of new centers of China watching. Hong Kong less so, because Hong Kong has problems due to the Chinese National Security Act. But reporters are sitting here doing essentially a modern day version of what I was doing in the 70s and what other people who are in assignment China were doing in the 50s and 60s, which is trying to figure out the tea leaves from outside, because you can't get it from inside, which is immensely important work, but immensely frustrating because you're missing so much by not being on the scene.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I kind of feel like, given my background, I should have already known this. But one thing I sort of learned from reading your book was just this term, China Watcher. I've used this term myself a million times in a general way to describe, primarily academic scholars who are doing research about China or just paying attention to China. But I didn't really realize that the source of this term was, yeah, literally these reporters who were in Hong Kong, like watching all of the news and everything coming out of China, trying to figure out what was really going on. And there is, yeah, it's like you said, it's kind of coming back around. I know that certain people have sort of been advocating to have new kind of like a Kremlinology for China, where they just look at the language being used by the Communist Party in China, and through the specific language that they use, which kind of has its own there's a built-in meaning for party members that people wouldn't otherwise know, that's very subtle, to sort of train people to learn how to do this and even develop academic programs that are based just on this one skill of reading Communist Party language. And it does seem to strike a very similar tone to what those China Watchers were doing.
I think it's very important. And sadly, what you're witnessing in China today is kind of the closing off of China. You hear this in so many ways. I was talking to a Western diplomat recently who visited China a few months ago and was talking about how it was so hard to have any contact with people or to have conversations with people. And so the skills of China watching, which feature prominently in Assignment China, have become very important again as a critical tool. I mean, you have a situation today where China is more powerful and more influential than it's ever been. And because of this closing off of China, our information about the society and in particular about the inner workings of the leadership has shrunk in a way dramatically. Arguably, I think you could make a case now that we know as little about the internal dynamics at the very top now as we did during the days of Mao, and possibly even less. And the irony is this happens in spite of the fact that Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders appear on television, they attend international meetings, they greet other foreign leaders and so on. But what's going on behind the scenes, we really don't know. And so you're thrown back on these toolkit, which is very imprecise and it's not like chemistry. It's not a formula. You put 3 and 3 together, you don't automatically get 6. But it's increasingly important part of the toolkit for anybody trying to make sense of China, because there are so few other good alternatives.
Well, let's take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit about your own career and experience reporting in China. You opened the book with this story of Yu Kexin, and you sort of use that as a way to illustrate for the audience what it was like reporting in China at that time, and how things have changed. So why don't you tell us that story and why you think that helps illustrate what it's like?
I first went to China in 1973 with an American student group, and this was just a year after Nixon's trip. So it was one of the very first American groups to go to China. And we spent a month there, and it was a classic sort of political tour. We went to model factories and model communes and model schools, and everywhere we went, we got the brief introduction, the jieshao from the local official telling us how much better everything was now than before liberation, or how much better it was after the Cultural Revolution or whatever. So we went to this one people's commune, and they broke us into small groups to have lunch with the peasants. And so I had lunch at the home of a guy named Yu Kexin, and it was, for me, kind of the highlight of the trip, because it was a chance to have a little bit more unstructured back and forth interaction with like a what seemed to be a relatively normal person in his family. It was a great meal. We got to sit in his house and stuff like this. And so it remained sort of a very vivid memory for me. 20 years later, as the CNN Beijing bureau chief, I got the idea to try to redo my 1973 trip. because I thought if I could track down some of the people that I'd met and go to some of the places that I'd visited, it would give me a very interesting way to convey some of the changes that had happened in China, because in those intervening 20 years, Deng Xiaoping had taken power, China had initiated these market reforms, the landscape was changing, the economy was growing, people's lives were very different. So I managed to track Yu Kexin down, and we went and we visited him and had a very nice time. And he was living in this new apartment with a television set, and he and his son had set up like a tire repair factory, and were making workshop at making more money and so on. But when the minders, the guides who set this all up and who always were hovering around, were out of earshot, he turned to me and he said, when you were here in 1973, basically everything you saw was fake. The meal that you liked so much had actually been trucked in by the authorities the day before to impress the foreigners. And in point of fact, we only ate meat once a month, and our daily staple was maize gruel. And we really were having a lousy time, and I couldn't tell you any of that. And so to me, that became emblematic of the challenge that one faces trying to figure out what's reality in China. And I think it cuts to the heart of the challenge that all foreign journalists have faced, which is that the Chinese Communist Party has been determined to control the narrative, both internally and externally, and shapes what it will allow people to see and learn and where they can go, what they can do, and who they can talk to. And the international press has battled against that from the beginning with varying degrees of success, sometimes getting nowhere, sometimes making dramatic progress. But it's this endless fight. And so I thought that really symbolized the nature of the challenge that journalists, that I faced personally, that journalists faced then and still face today.
Yeah, and on a related note, one of the episodes that you talk about in the book is, of course, Nixon's famous visit to China, which was one of the first times that a lot of, after a period of closing from the Cultural Revolution, the first time many journalists were allowed back in to report on China once again and to report specifically on the trip. But what struck me about that section was an important part was that it was one of the first big presidential trips which, as you describe in the book, was purely designed for television rather than other types of news. But also the choreography of where they would allow journalists to go and what they would see and sort of all the things that they had prepared for them sort of reminds one of the stories you hear about North Korea and the way that those tours go if you're a tourist in North Korea. But in this case, it wasn't just the Chinese who wanted it this way. It seemed to also be the American president who kind of wanted it this way. So tell us a little bit about that trip and what made it so different.
Well, having made 17 trips of my own to North Korea, I can testify that the choreography of particularly that period there are a lot of similarities. But you had a case where you had this odd convergence of interest between the Nixon White House and the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. That being said, it took a major effort by the White House and by Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor in particular, to convince the Chinese to let in large numbers of journalists and to agree to allow them to bring in satellite transmission equipment and to allow some of the major events like Nixon's arrival or the welcoming banquet hosted by Premier Zhou Enlai to be televised live. But once the Chinese kind of figured it out, that there was value in this from the propaganda point of view, there was this real convergence of interest. And so what Nixon wanted was essentially a television extravaganza that showed him leading the way to this dramatic diplomatic breakthrough that only he could achieve. And the Chinese structured it in such a way that they got the images that they wanted out, and the Nixon White House was quite content to work with the Chinese authorities to make sure that's what it was, and they weren't bothered by things that were transparently staged and stuff like that. There's one memorable episode where Nixon went to the Ming Tombs, and it was a freezing cold day, but there were all of these people out there like listening to the radio and having a picnic and so on. And Nixon went and got his photo opportunity, and then he went off. And Ted Koppel, who was a correspondent with ABC News at the time, who'd actually been based in Hong Kong in the late 60s and who later went on to become very famous as the host of Nightline, which was a wonderful ABC News magazine broadcast that went for many years. Ted Koppel said, "I'm really suspicious about this." So when the press bus left, he told his crew, "We're staying." And once all the foreigners had left, this truck came, and these commissars got off, and they took all the radios, portable radios, and they took all the picnic baskets away, and they stuck them all in a truck, and they drove them off. It was completely staged. And Koppel did a piece about this, and he said that later Henry Kissinger told him that Premier Zhou Enlai had apologized. So we were kind of, overdid it there.
Yeah, for being so ham-fisted.
Yeah. But that was a fascinating example of where the Nixon didn't care. He got his photo opportunity. And if the press were manipulated, too bad for the press. And the fact was that China was so new and the whole event was so dramatic that whatever the frustrations of the press, it was still such a revelation, even to just see any Chinese doing anything, that the reporters kind of ended up playing along with it, even though they didn't want to, because A, that was what was on offer, and B, it was so amazing in and of its own right, even if it was staged, because it was all so new.
Yeah, I mean, because to be, I've considered before the ban was reinstated, I myself kind of wanted to visit North Korea, kind of for the same reason. Everything is staged, but what they decide to show you is fascinating in its own way.
Absolutely.
But another thing that struck me about reading this section of the book about Nixon's trip was how often the journalists at that time would describe going to China like going to as otherworldly. Barbara Walters said it was like setting foot on some distant planet. She said it was like going to the moon. And Dan Rather said it was like setting foot on a distant planet. And Dirk Halstead said that it was the most important presidential trip ever. And he said that with the exception of the president going to Mars, no one would ever be able to have a trip like that again. And I don't know, just really struck me how often you saw these metaphors about otherworldliness in China.
You forget that in 1972, there had probably been, more Americans on the moon than American journalists in China. It had been absolutely cut off for almost 25 years, during which you'd had the Korean War, and then you'd had all of China's internal preoccupations with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and so on. So it was absolutely unknown. And even, when I went in 73, it was exactly the same feeling. It was like going to another world. And that was part of the appeal, certainly for me, piqued my curiosity. But I think everybody had that sense. And Dirk Halstead, who was a great photographer who covered the Nixon trip for UPI, I think it's a valid point. I can't imagine any other circumstances of an American presidential visit that was quite as extraordinary as setting foot in this place that Americans had essentially never been, and they just didn't have the slightest idea what it was going to be like. And so to discover anything about the Chinese was a revelation. And that's partly why the staging became a secondary issue, because even if it was staged, it was still a glimpse of a place that no one had ever seen for decades.
Yeah, and another thing that struck me about that section, and of course has relevance for Taiwan, which is that that trip did produce the Shanghai Communique, which is so central to U.S.-China relations and the whole cross-strait issue today. But that the reporters who went on that trip really that got no preview of those negotiations or what was happening there. So there was kind of, like just there was a show going on over here and they were focused on that and it was great TV. And the substance, they only discovered kind of along with everyone else when the communique itself came out. And there's a great quote actually from Tom Jarrell from ABC News. And he was just saying that whether they had communiques at the end of the talks was important for the diplomats and foreign affairs reporters, but for generalists like me, he being Nixon, had already had a home run.
Exactly, and Bernard Kalb of CBS said, it was China, the secret dragon. The TV pictures were a wow, and it did blow people away. I have very vivid memories of sitting in my living room, watching these. I had already started studying Chinese, so I was really interested in it, but it was amazing to actually see this. It really existed. It wasn't some figment of somebody's imagination. It was quite an extra, and I think that also, particularly for television, colored some of the coverage. It took a while for the gee whiz quality to subside, and particularly for TV because the pictures were so like gee whiz. The print people were much less so, and I think after Nixon's trip, you start seeing, in the coverage of the sort of the Mao's declining years and the power struggles around his death and so on. That's very solid, straight coverage. And there was some on broadcast as well. But certainly the preponderance of it was still this kind of, oh, look at these exotic Chinese, and this is how they go to school, and this is how they raise their kids, and so on. And it was all so new that it's, you can understand it, but it did create a kind of a slightly awkward imbalance.
So the end of that trip, that's about the time that you went to China yourself and started setting up the Beijing bureau for CNN. And it also seems to be in the book kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a golden age, but one of the most open times for reporters going to China, or at least a huge difference from the previous era. So, what was it like when you first arrived, and what was it like to be a journalist in China at that time?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that the sort of the late 80s and the sort of late 90s, early 2000s were really the golden years in terms of journalistic access. I arrived in 87, and the reforms were just beginning to sort of take effect. There was this tremendous sense of excitement and of possibility and of experimentation and a tremendous pent-up popular desire to see things, do things differently. I remember one of the first stories that I did with my camera crew. There was an international makeup exhibition at the Beijing Exhibition Center in the fall of 87. And these crowds of young women almost literally, knocked down the doors to get in to see what Estee Lauder and L'Oreal and all of these brands were offering, because these were people who for years had to dress in shades of gray and blue and white and wear a little Mao button on their lapel, and makeup was barred, and looking pretty or attractive was considered bourgeois. And to me, it exemplified the way in which people were trying to were bursting out of the repression of the Mao years. And you saw that in a great many areas. Socially and intellectually, there was a tremendous kind of curiosity about the rest of the world. There was great interest in political alternatives and interest in learning about the United States. You had the first Chinese rock musicians. You had all, the discos, all sorts of things that were absolutely new, kind of revolutionary almost. And so even though there were still restrictions on reporters, you still had to get permission 10 days in advance from the WWII, the Foreign Affairs Office, of any place you wanted to go outside of Beijing. You still had minders. It wasn't like a free, we weren't just free to go anywhere and do anything. But the bonds were loosening, and the currents in the society that were just bubbling up. And so it was a tremendously exciting period. Of course, that climaxed in that helped produce the atmosphere that led to the Tiananmen Square protests in '89, which were extraordinarily interesting and moving and exciting, but then ended very, very badly. And you had a period of political repression, which really never left, even though it opened up economically and socially again within a couple of years.
Yeah, and of course you were there during those protests, and for me, that was one of the most fascinating parts of the book, to read that all the stories from the Tiananmen Square and the coverage there. And one small little technical thing about being a TV reporter at that time that I hadn't really thought that much about. I had just assumed, I guess, that by the late 1980s, getting a live feed from a foreign country wasn't really a big deal, that most TV channels were doing it. But that was, getting a constant live feed from those protests actually ended up being one of the great challenges of the coverage. So tell us a little bit about that and what CNN was able to do.
Well, today you can pull your iPhone out and go live from anywhere in the world. And so people don't appreciate how remarkably challenging it was to do a live transmission. Back then, it required having access to a satellite dish, which was usually 3 meters in width, and all sorts of technology that went along with it. Normally in Beijing, when we wanted to send like a routine story before Tiananmen, you would pay $2,000 for 10 minutes of satellite time, and you would drive to the China Central Television station, and the engineers would put your tape in a machine and they would play it out, and most of the time it worked. And that's how the only other way to get your material out was to put your videotape in a shipping bag and ship it to Hong Kong or Tokyo or someplace where there was a production center that could do the same thing. But the thing that was so interesting about Tiananmen was that the big story that spring was not going to be Tiananmen. The big story that spring was going to be the visit to China by the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, which was going to bring an end to the 30-year-long Sino-Soviet dispute. And this was going to be Deng Xiaoping's crowning diplomatic achievement, having normalized relations with the U.S. He was now going to put relations with the Soviet Union on a better footing and end the Sino-Soviet dispute. So it was a huge story, and we thought that it deserved blanket coverage. And so CNN asked for permission to bring in satellite dish, engineers, other equipment, other producers, reporters, editors, and the Chinese said yes. And what happened was that the protesters literally stole the stage on which the Gorbachev visit was supposed to happen, so that, for example, we got permission to do live broadcasts from the rostrum of Tiananmen Square, which is where Chairman Mao would stand and wave to the assembled Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. It's where he proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic. And we got permission to do a live broadcast from there because we set up what was called a microwave link, which beamed our signal to the satellite dish that we had, which was at a hotel in Beijing. And on the morning of the 15th of May, 1989, I'll never forget it, we got up on the rostrum, and the view was not a welcoming ceremony for Gorbachev, but tens of thousands of protesters who'd occupied Tiananmen. And we had the live signal up, and well, it's news, so you do it. And basically, the Chinese authorities were so preoccupied with all the stuff going on that this just slipped their minds in some fashion. They didn't do anything about it. So we were able to have an entire week of round-the-clock live broadcasts. And then other networks were able to do the same thing. So this extraordinary week with literally millions of people in Tiananmen calling for political change, greater freedom, and more representative government, and so on, in a country like China that had been cut off and isolated certainly from the West for years and years and years, suddenly it was in everybody's living room. And it was an absolutely unprecedented moment for China, and it was an unprecedented moment in the history of broadcast journalism, because it never happened.
Yeah, and another really interesting anecdote from the story. Oh, and I should also let the audience know that it just so happens that your birthday is also June 4th.
The anniversary of Tiananmen, that's
yes. which I also learned from reading the book. But there was this story about when CNN's live feed got shut down, and that that was created what is sometimes called the CNN effect, where because live news was so rare back then, usually other people who were involved in a story didn't have to respond to it in real time. But in this case, some government officials came to shut down the feed. Then you started showing footage of these officials trying to shut down the feed. And on top of that, there was an interview going on at CNN at the time with the Secretary of State, who was then asked about what had just happened on the live TV. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there actually were two separate episodes that were really among the very earliest examples of what became known as the CNN effect. So the first one was after Gorbachev left China, the Chinese came in and said, we are ordering you to cease your satellite transmissions. And we said, yes, but we have a contract that still goes on longer. And they said, no, that's it. So a colleague of mine started negotiating with these officials, and we managed to hook up a camera. So this whole dynamic of dealing with stubborn Chinese communist officials ordering you to stop what you're doing was broadcast all over the world. That was it remains a very interesting lesson in how that whole process works. But in the end, my colleague insisted that they get this in writing, and so, and then the transmission went black. So 2 weeks later, the tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. At that point, there were no live video transmissions, but we had a phone line set up. We were in a room at the Beijing hotel, which overlooks Chang'an Boulevard, so you could see into the northern end of Tiananmen Square. And I was just standing on the balcony doing essentially live commentary, hour after hour after hour, and talking about seeing bullets and soldiers and bodies and what have you. And in the middle of all of this, James Baker, who was the Secretary of State, came on a previously scheduled CNN talk show. And it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Saturday, Washington time, which was 2 o'clock in the morning, Sunday in Beijing, right in the middle of all this mayhem. So the host comes to me and says, here's an update with Mike Chinoy. And so I talk about what I'm seeing and so on. And then the host says to Baker, Mr. Secretary, what's American policy on this? And when I interviewed Baker for Assignment China, he said, I was thinking to myself, oh my God, what am I going to do here? Because he had no chance to talk to the American embassy. They hadn't produced a cable. They had no idea where this was going. No opportunity to weigh up all the implications before putting out a statement. And so this was really one of the earliest instances where the fact that news was on TV live was driving decision making by key actors like the American government in a way that it hadn't done before. And now it's absolutely common. You see something on TV, immediately you need an answer. And so the whole time frame gets telescoped, and which is not necessarily a good thing, because it makes it harder to sort of not react in the moment. And, if the camera's pointing one way, you see a very powerful image, but maybe if it were pointing the other way, there was another image which says a different part of the story that's not factored into what the actor is responding to. So it complicates things very considerably. But that became known as the CNN effect, because this was a very, very early instance of it, and it happened in Tiananmen.
Yeah, and one other thing I was going to just say is I went back and watched the footage of the officials coming to shut down the feed, and there was sort of two things that struck me about it. One was how surprisingly polite they seemed to be about it, and that, they weren't in police uniforms or whatever. But also the fact that, the producer there insisted that we have this contract and we're not going to shut down just because you tell me. We want something in writing. And their solution to that was to literally just get a pad and paper and write by hand. We're telling you to shut this down.
And then Vito Maggiolo, who was another producer, yelled, you can hear this out of the corner. He says, what about the chop? And these guys said, forget the chop. Here's your piece of paper. Pull the plug and end the transmission.
Yeah, because I just cannot imagine that happening today.
No, it's a different. I mean, they were not uncivil.
Yeah.
I mean, they were doing their job, and we were doing our job, and there wasn't they weren't coming in and beating anybody over the head. They were just telling us what the new rules of the game were.
And in the book, unfortunately, it did seem that after the Tiananmen incident, there was a kind of a changing of the guard, that almost all of the journalists who had previously been in China at that point sort of rotated out. Tell us a little bit about that transition.
Well, a lot of journalists left. I mean, partly people were burned out, and partly it's just a normal rotation. By the early 90s, you had a new crop in. But I think the atmosphere was still very much shaped by sort of the shadow of Tiananmen, and accentuated by the fact that the U.S. government, particularly under Bill Clinton, tried to link human rights to granting China most favored nation trading privileges. So human rights became this central feature of the U.S.-China relationship, and while journalists don't do what they're told by American journalists don't do what they're told by the American government, quite the opposite, but what the American government considers important gets covered because it's an important American government priority, so you pay attention to it. So that meant that there was a great deal of attention on human rights in the early mid-90s. Much of it justifiable, but one of the consequences was that the focus was so much on human rights that I think some of the press didn't really pick up as early as they might have otherwise the fact that Deng Xiaoping had sort of jump-started the economic reforms again. Eventually, it became glaringly obvious, and that became the kind of central feature of the China story from the mid-90s on. But it took a little while for people to shake off the Tiananmen shadow, to realize that while it might be something that was a big deal in Washington, for most Chinese people, the reactivation of the reform process and the economic opportunities that opened was a much bigger story. And that then became in the mid-late 90s, the early sort of instances of the China boom and the phenomenon of millions of farmers coming from the countryside into the coastal areas to work in these joint venture factories, and every locality wanting to create an investment zone. And that, interestingly, led to a bit of a change in the treatment of foreign journalists, because now, with Tiananmen a little bit in rearview mirror, journalists were welcome. If you please write a story about our investment zone. Maybe we'll get investment. How do we get rich? How do we get foreign companies to come? And so on. And so that meant that access became easier, and the focus of the story shifted. It wasn't just the butchers of Beijing repressing the heroic democracy protesters. It was a much more complex dynamic of the Chinese economy taking off, and so it made the late 90s a much kind of more easier period to be in China. It wasn't as restrictive as the focus of the story shifted.
Obviously, the big story about foreign journalists in China today is that there aren't that many of them there. And a lot of that has to do with COVID and what happened during that period. So tell us a little bit about, how COVID unfolded for the journalists there, and how we sort of got to the situation now where it does seem like we're, as you said, entering another phase where China's a little bit more closed off.
I think even before COVID, the trends under Xi Jinping were very much towards his personal consolidation of power and squeezing what little was left of civil society in China. And so it was already getting harder for journalists. Access was not as easy. People you talked to were getting intimidated. It didn't prevent journalists from still doing some groundbreaking work, and that included, in the run-up to COVID, digging up very compelling evidence about the repression in Xinjiang and people avoiding restrictions and going there and getting testimony and buttressing it with that of exiled Uyghurs in Turkey and so on. But the trend was already towards tightening. And then when COVID broke out, they instituted this lockdown policy, and that that made it hard to move. There were a few very intrepid journalists who went to Wuhan and stayed. Chris Buckley of the New York Times being one of the most notable examples. He got in right when Wuhan was locked down and basically stayed for the entire lockdown at great personal risk, I would say, since nobody knew how scary this disease was going to be. But that made moving around China difficult in general. And then in the middle of that, in the spring of 2020, the Chinese government expelled nearly 24 journalists from the New York Times and Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. And that was partly in retaliation for moves by the Trump administration to limit the number of Chinese journalists in the States. And I think you could argue that the Chinese got the better of the deal there, because the Chinese journalists in the U.S. were essentially harmless, but the American journalists in China were really digging into Chinese society. And the places that lost journalists, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and so on, were people who had large numbers of staff members, and could really devote resources to digging and investigative journalism. And then China essentially walled itself off from the rest of the world, so nobody could get in. The very few journalists who were not kicked out and didn't have their visas canceled were told, if you leave, you can leave, but you can't come back. And so by the time, as the COVID drama unfolded, what you had was a China that was increasingly inaccessible to the rest of the world. And that coincided with an intensification of this kind of xenophobic, hyper-nationalistic tone and approach that has been characteristic of the Xi Jinping regime, and it's affected China's internal dynamics and its external relations. And it's still true even today that it's exceptionally difficult for foreign journalists to get visas. So you have a very, very small number who are on the ground operating in very difficult conditions. They're still operating, they're still doing their jobs as best they can, but it's even harder to travel. Journalists are finding that people are increasingly reluctant to talk to them, either because they're scared of getting into trouble, or because, having absorbed several years of state-run propaganda about how all foreign journalists are spies, they're actively hostile. And so you have any number of episodes where journalists go somewhere to do something and they're confronted not by an officious local official blocking them from reporting, but by just suspicious ordinary people blocking them from reporting. So it's becoming very, very difficult. And I think what is lost in this, which is tragic and dangerous, is a sense of China as a sort of living, breathing, complex society of 1.4 million individual human beings, each of whom with their own hopes and fears and desires and frustrations and ambitions and achievements and failures and so on. And instead, because that's so difficult to access now because of the limitations, the focus of the coverage is much more on what is more accessible, and that is the diplomatic nastiness and the denunciations and the official statements and the U.S.-China rivalry, or China throwing its weight around internationally. So that is where the preponderance of the coverage is focused now. And the sense of China as a kind of living, breathing society, which is critical to figuring out where this country is going, is in danger of being lost to a significant degree. It wouldn't surprise me if there are all kinds of phenomena playing out in Chinese society about which we haven't a clue or the barest inkling of, because you just can't get there. And the other problem with so few journalists in China is that even if these limitations weren't as suffocating as they are, the nature of the news business now, in which reporters have to file instantaneously for the internet, and they have to tweet, and they have to be on social media, means that the days when you can say to your editor, I'm going off to a farm in Hubei for 12 days, and I'm going to come back and give you 3 fantastic pieces about life in the countryside in China, which provide all kinds of insights that you can only get by being on a farm in Hubei for 12 days, is gone. I mean, you could do that when I was there even, or in other periods. But you can't now, partly because they might not let you. And even if they let you, your news organization isn't going to let you be out of pocket for 12 days because you're not tweeting 10 times a day and filing every time the foreign ministry issues a statement about something. So the whole dynamic has changed, and the result is we're in danger of missing something very crucial about that is central to being able to understand China.
Well, as you say, the thing we report on is the thing that's accessible, and I think relevant to where we're sitting right now is the fact that one thing that is accessible is Taiwan. And so a lot of journalists have set up camp here, basically still reporting on China, but China watching as they used to from Hong Kong, but now from across the strait here. And I do kind of wonder, because I think one difference between reporting from Hong Kong as a China watcher and reporting from Taiwan is the kind of the cross-strait dynamic, the political dynamic between Taiwan and China. And I wonder if you have a sense of how that affects coverage of China. Does being, in the place that, for very good reasons has a very strong point of view about the place you're reporting on, do you think that has influenced the narrative, the coverage, or anything else related to reporters doing China these days from Taiwan?
I think there's no question that if you're doing China from Taiwan, the Taiwan-China dynamic is front and center, and it shapes everything in a way which it doesn't if you're sitting in Hong Kong trying to make sense of China. And there are plenty of good sort of people who study China in Taiwan that are good sources and resources and so on. But even there, it's still the lens through which China is viewed is very much the cross-strait lens. So that affects, I think, a lot of what you do. You get a lot of stories. It's a hugely important story, and it's not a bad thing that there's more of it. And it's very good that you're getting more coverage just of Taiwan as a living, breathing entity in and of its own right. I mean, it's one of the world's most important economies. It's got 23 million people. It's got the freest press in Asia. It's a remarkable place. It deserves to be covered as more than just an adjunct of the Taiwan-China story. And I think the mere fact that there are so many more foreign journalists here, the major media have beefed up. CNN has a bureau here now, for example, which never did before. So Taiwan is getting treated more in its own right as a serious place. But that being said, the preponderance of coverage is still very much through the cross-strait lens. Whether that and I don't know, if you want to do a story on agriculture in Sichuan from Taiwan, not so easy. But you are at least in a culturally, broadly speaking, Chinese society where the language is Chinese, where there are people going back and forth, where there are connections. So you don't feel that disconnected on the one hand. On the other hand, you're utterly disconnected because it's not the People's Republic. So it's a kind of weird dynamic. But on balance, I think it's good that people are here, and it's very good that Taiwan is getting taken more seriously in and of its own right. But is weighing up how good the coverage of China is from here? Hard to say. But a lot of what people do for covering China here is what they'd be doing sitting in Washington or sitting in Seoul or sitting in Hong Kong, which is reading the Chinese internet, talking to travelers, perusing the Chinese media, making whatever phone calls you can to anybody who will pick up the phone at the other end, and seeing what picture comes out of that process.
The book is fascinating. I recommend that all of our listeners go and pick it up. I did want to ask you, though, about the documentary series, Assignment China. Will you continue? Will that be an ongoing thing? Will that, because right now it's not covering the COVID period and all of that. So.
Probably not. I think, we did a dozen episodes, and for lots of reasons, that's going to be where it is. But it's it's a compliment to the book because one of the reasons to do the book is that when you do a documentary film, there's lots of wonderful material that never makes it into the documentary because of time constraints or technical reasons. And so there's lots and lots in the book that people said when I interviewed them that I couldn't fit into the documentary film. And also it's fascinating to see what these people actually looked and sounded like, and to see the images of, from the 50s and 60s. I mean, to me, as a history buff. So I think you can enjoy both of them, both as a reference to, what it was like then. I think for people who are interested in journalism, it's fascinating to know what the people who came before were like and what they did. And I think ultimately the key factor is, if you're interested in China and concerned about China, to understand how the news about China is reported helps make you a much more sophisticated consumer of what you're seeing and reading and hearing today, and that will help you make much more intelligent judgments about what is going on at a sort of pivotal moment in modern history.
Are there any plans for a Chinese translation of the book?
Chinese translation of the book will be coming out in Taiwan on the 1st of February.
Okay, great. And so last question. After having done all this research and putting this pretty massive project together over the years, and with the kind of unique situation that reporters are in now, or maybe it's not that unique. I guess that's my question to you. I mean, what do you see in the near future in terms of reporting on China?
I think reporters are going to have to really hone their China watching skills, learn a lot from those who came before about how to cover a place without being able to go there, because that is really increasingly the challenge, to develop the skill set to read the tea leaves, to peruse the Chinese media, to study the Chinese internet, to take advantage of China's international engagement elsewhere, to get closer to things Chinese and to get clues, and then try and put the mosaic together in a way that hopefully history will prove was more accurate than not. But it's a big challenge, and the stakes are enormous because China is much more important internationally now than it's ever been. So getting an understanding of China right is that much more important.
All right. Well, yes, I hope that it is just cyclical and there will be another open period, another golden age of reporting in China. But until then, I'm happy to be able to have people like you here in Taiwan for me to talk to.
All I can say, just to finish, is when I went to China in 1973, I walked across the bridge from Hong Kong to Shenzhen. And Shenzhen was a tiny little fishing village of a few streets and a few water buffaloes. And if you had told me that 25 years later, Shenzhen would look like Hong Kong, I would have thought you were absolutely crazy. So I say that to make the point that dramatic, unthinkable changes in China have happened quite regularly and with quite astonishing speed in certainly my lifetime. So the fact that we have a situation that may seem set in stone today doesn't mean at some point, and possibly even sooner rather than later, it's going to remain that way. So I think we have to be prepared for the possibility of quite abrupt and dramatic changes in ways we may not necessarily be able to predict. But it's not static, even though it may seem on the surface static at the moment.
All right, Mike Chinoy, thank you so much for coming in today.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, that brings us to the end of my interview with Mike Chinoy. That was a conversation I really enjoyed. So everyone do yourselves a favor and go buy his book. Well, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is my last episode for RTI, but I'm continuing the show on an independent RSS feed. I've already got a few episodes in the can, including an interview with a transportation expert about motorcycle ownership in Taiwan. Taiwan has the highest rate of motorcycle ownership in the world, actually, which has important consequences for the society here. I also conducted a very interesting interview with a well-known member of Taiwan's DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. So please subscribe to the show and keep an eye out for those episodes, which should be coming out pretty soon. Unfortunately, the URL for the podcast feed itself is quite long, so I think it will be easiest for people to go to the new show website and copy the RSS link there, or you can also listen directly on the website. The URL for the new show website is shows.acast.com/the Straight Up Podcast. And here there is a hyphen or a dash mark in between each of the words, the Straight Up Podcast. And also straight is spelled like the Taiwan Strait, Strait. So once again, that's shows.acast.com/the-straight-up-podcast. Wow, that's pretty rough to do that over audio, but hopefully you'll be able to find it. I've also put a link to the new website in the show notes for this episode, so please take a look at that. Anyway, the show will also soon be up on other platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., so you can also look for it there very soon. One important thing to note is that I have slightly changed the title of the show to differentiate it from the old RTI feed, so the new name of the show, if you search for it, is The Straight Up Podcast with Chris Gorin. I just added my name to the end there. I'm also considering a complete title change, just so that people don't have trouble finding the new feed. So if you have any suggestions for a new show title or potential guests or anything else really, feel free to shoot me an email at chrisegorin@gmail.com. That's CHRIS, the letter E, GORIN @gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter, or X as it's now called. My handle is at Chris_Gorin. And if you regularly follow English language media outlets based in Taiwan, you will no doubt both be seeing and hearing from me very soon. And I just want to say thank you to all of my listeners out there, both on shortwave and through the podcast. It's really been fun to make this show, and I also feel like I finally found something that I'm both good at and that is useful to other people, and I'm very grateful for that. So I look forward to seeing you all out there in podcast world. Until next time, this has been the Straight Up Podcast with Chris Gorin. Bye.
It's a straight up podcast.